The rescue shuttle descended through the canopy like a silver bird of prey, and its searchlights cut through the darkness around the monitoring station. Suri's father stood in the open bay door with a sonic deterrent rifle in his hands and his eyes scanning the ground below. He had brought 6 other Cathari traders with him, and they were all armed with the best weapons their caravan could provide. The Thornbacks hesitated when they saw the shuttle. They were smart enough to recognize a threat that outmatched them, but they were also hungry and angry, and they had spent hours hunting these 2 pieces of prey. Some of them decided to fight. The sonic deterrent screamed through the air, and Thornbacks fell writhing to the ground. As their sensitive hearing organs overloaded with pain, energy weapons flashed and burned through armored hides. Within minutes, the siege was broken, and the survivors fled into the forest howling with defeat. Suri's father was the first to enter the station, and he found his daughter standing over an unconscious human with a fire extinguisher raised like a club. Jinho had collapsed moments before the rescue arrived. His body had given everything it had and more, but he was breathing, and the anti-venom was still working, and he would live. Suri dropped the fire extinguisher and ran to her father and wrapped her arms around him and finally let herself cry. He held her tight and stroked her feathers and told her that everything was going to be okay now. But Suri pulled back and looked at him with fierce determination in her young eyes. She said they had to help the human first. She said he had saved her life, and they owed him everything. Her father looked at the unconscious man on the floor, and then at his daughter, and he nodded slowly. They loaded Jinho onto the shuttle and flew him to the nearest Cathari medical facility. It was not designed for human physiology, but the doctors did their best. They pumped him full of fluids and treated his wounds and monitored his vital signs through the night. Suri refused to leave his side. She sat in a chair next to his bed and watched him breathe and thought about everything that had happened. Her father came to check on her and found her asleep with her head resting on the edge of Jinho's bed. He stood in the doorway for a long time and considered what he was seeing. The Cathari had always been cautious about humans. They respected their technology and their determination, but they also feared their unpredictability. Humans made decisions that seemed insane by Cathari standards. They took risks that no sensible being would take. They threw themselves into danger for strangers and causes that had nothing to do with their own survival. Suri's father had always viewed this as a weakness, but now he was looking at a man who had nearly died to save a child he had never met. He was looking at courage that went beyond calculation, and he was beginning to understand that maybe the Cathari definition of bravery was too narrow. Jinho woke up 3 days later. The first thing he saw was Suri's face hovering over him with an expression of intense relief. She told him he was an idiot for almost dying, and he laughed even though it hurt his ribs. Her father entered the room and introduced himself as Counselor Tarek of the Western Trading Consortium. He thanked Jinho formally and stiffly in the manner of Cathari politics, but then his formal manner broke and he clasped Jinho's hand with both of his own. He said that no words could express what he owed this human. Jinho said he did not want thanks. He said he had just done what anyone would have done. Tarek shook his head and said that was not true. He said that most beings would have watched from a safe distance and told themselves there was nothing they could do. He said that Jinho had chosen a different path. 1 week later, a formal ceremony took place in the main hall of the Cathari settlement on Varus 4. All the major families were present, and the human ambassador had been invited as well. Jinho stood awkwardly in borrowed clothes that did not quite fit and wondered what he had gotten himself into. Suri stood beside him and explained that this was a nest friend ceremony. It was one of the highest honors the Cathari could bestow on an outsider. It meant that Jinho was now considered family to her bloodline. He would always have a place at their table and a roof over his head. He would be defended as one of their own. Jinho did not know what to say. He had come to Varus 4 to be alone. He had not planned to become part of anyone's family ever again. But as he looked at Suri and her father and the gathered Cathari, who were watching him with new respect in their eyes, he felt something shift in his chest. The grief was still there. It would always be there. But maybe it did not have to be the only thing. Suri's grandmother was given the honor of conducting the ceremony because she was the eldest of the family. She placed a woven band around Jinho's wrist and spoke words in the old Cathari language that made several people in the audience cry. Then she looked at Jinho with ancient eyes and spoke in trade common so everyone could understand. She said that courage was not the absence of fear. She said that courage was feeling the fear and standing up anyway. She said that humans had always confused the Cathari because they seemed to make choices that defied logic and reason, but she understood now. She said that humans did not weigh odds the way her people did. When humans saw someone in danger, they did not calculate the probability of success. They saw a person who needed help and they moved. This was not weakness. This was strength of a kind the galaxy rarely saw. The ceremony concluded, and Jinho was surrounded by Cathari who wanted to meet him and thank him and ask him questions about human customs. He answered as best he could while Suri translated the more difficult concepts. Later that night he walked back to his monitoring station to gather his belongings. The door was still broken and the walls were still damaged, but he smiled when he saw it. This ugly little building had held together just long enough. He was packing his data tablets when he heard footsteps behind him. Suri stood in the doorway with a backpack over her shoulders. She said she had convinced her parents to let her apprentice with him. She said she wanted to learn about wildlife biology and conservation and all the things he studied. She said she wanted to understand what made humans the way they were. Jinho looked at her for a long moment. Then he handed her one of his data tablets and told her they could start with Lesson 1 tomorrow. The frontier world of Varus 4 turned slowly beneath its twin suns. In a damaged monitoring station, a human and a Cathari began to plan their first field survey together. The forest stretched out around them, full of danger and wonder and possibilities. And somewhere in the distance, a pack of thornbacks clicked to each other about the strange soft creature that had taught them to be afraid the end. The monitoring station appeared through the trees like a vision from a dream. It was a squat metal building with reinforced walls and a satellite dish on the roof and lights glowing warm and yellow in the windows. Suri had never been so happy to see an ugly building in her entire life. She had dragged Jinho the last kilometer through pure determination and fear. The clicking sounds had followed them the whole way, but the surviving thornbacks seemed hesitant to attack again. Maybe they had learned to be careful around humans. Maybe they were just waiting for the right moment. Suri did not care about their reasons. She only cared about getting inside those metal walls. The door had a security panel, and Suri had no idea what the code might be. She slapped her palm against it in frustration, and the panel beeped and turned green. Jinho must have programmed it to accept biometric readings from any sapient species. She would have to thank him for that later. If he survived, the door slid open, and Suri dragged Jinho inside, and the door slid shut behind them with a solid thunk that made her want to cry with relief. The interior of the station was cluttered with equipment and data screens and empty food containers. It smelled like a human had been living alone here for too long, but it was safe. The walls were thick and the door was strong, and for the first time since the storm, Suri felt like she might actually survive this nightmare. She found the medical supplies in a cabinet marked with a red cross symbol, and she searched through them until she found something labeled antivenom. The instructions were in human writing that she could not read, but there were pictures that showed how to use the injector. She pressed it against Jinho's arm and pushed the button and hoped she was not making a terrible mistake. Jinho's body jerked and his eyes flew open, and he gasped like someone who had just surfaced from deep water. He looked around wildly until his voice gaze found Suri, and then he relaxed. He asked where they were, and she told him, and he smiled weakly and said she was the bravest person he had ever met. Suri did not feel brave. She felt tired and scared and very, very young, but she smiled back and helped him sit up against the wall. The anti-venom was working. Color was returning to his face, and his hands had stopped trembling. He would live. Then the first impact hit the outer door. The whole station shook, and alarms began to blare and red. Lights flashed on every screen. Suri ran to the window and looked outside, and her heart sank into her feet. The Thornbacks had followed them. Both packs had set aside their differences and united. Against a common enemy, there were at least a dozen of them surrounding the station, and they were testing the walls with their claws and their bodies. Jinho pulled himself to his feet and stumbled to the main control panel. His fingers flew over the buttons as he checked systems and power levels and structural integrity. The news was not good. The station was designed for observation and research. It was meant to keep out the elements and the occasional curious animal. It was not meant to withstand a siege by a dozen apex predators. The outer door was already showing damage, and the walls had stress fractures forming at the corners. They had maybe an hour before something gave way. Jinho told Suri they needed to send a distress signal. The communications array had been damaged by the storm, but he might be able to jury-rig something if she could help him. Suri asked what she needed to do, and Jinho pointed at a panel on the wall that was sparking and smoking. He said the circuit breaker had tripped, and he needed her to reset. And while he worked on the transmitter, she ran to the panel and found the switch and pushed it back into position. The lights flickered and stabilized, and Jinho let out a breath of relief. He typed commands into the console and adjusted dials and muttered things that sounded like curses in his human language. Another impact shook the station, and this time they both heard metal groaning. The outer door was starting to buckle. Jinho worked faster, and Suri helped him by holding wires and passing tools and doing whatever he asked without question. They made a good team. The thought surprised her because she had always been taught that humans and Cathari were too different to work together effectively. But right now, they moved like parts of the same machine. The communications panel crackled, and Jinho spoke into it. He gave their coordinates and their situation, and described the number and type of predators outside. Static was the only response. He tried again, and still nothing came back. Suri felt hope draining away with each failed attempt. Then a voice broke through the static. It was fuzzy and broken, but she recognized it immediately. It was her father. He was alive, and he was looking for her, and he had heard their signal. Jinho told him to bring weapons and to hurry, and gave him directions to the station. Her father said he was coming, and then the signal dissolved into static. Suri wanted to cry with relief, but there was no time. The outer door finally gave way with a screech of tortured metal, and she could hear claws clicking on the floor of the entry corridor. Jinho grabbed a metal pipe from the wall and positioned himself between Suri and the inner door. He told her to hide in the storage closet and not to come out no matter what she heard. She refused. She had not dragged him 2 kilometers through a forest full of monsters just to hide in a closet while he died. She picked up a fire extinguisher and stood beside him. Jinho looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded. He said that if they were going to die, they would die standing together. The inner door began to bend inward as massive bodies slammed against it from the other side. Jinho raised his pipe, and Suri raised her extinguisher, and they waited. The door buckled. A claw punched through the gap, and outside the station, the sound of engines filled the air. The journey through the forest was slow and painful, and filled with sounds that made Suri's feathers stand on end. Jinho leaned heavily on her small shoulders, and his breathing came in ragged gasps that worried her more than she wanted to admit. The venom was spreading through his body, and she could see it in the way. His muscles twitched and his words slurred together, but he kept walking. Every time Suri thought he might collapse, he found some reserve of strength that pushed him forward. Another few steps. She did not understand where that strength came from. Her people believed that the body had limits and that exceeding those limits led to damage and death. Humans apparently believed something different. They talked as they walked, because talking seemed to help Jinho stay focused and awake. Suri asked him why he had come to Varus 4, and why he lived alone in a monitoring station, and why he had risked his life for someone he had never met. The answers came slowly and in pieces. That she had to assemble like a puzzle. Jinho had been a biologist on Earth, and he had studied predators and prey, and the delicate balance between them. He had a wife named Yuna, and a daughter named Minji, and they had been his entire world. Then, there was an accident. He did not describe the accident in detail, but Suri could hear the pain in his voice when he mentioned it. His daughter had been trapped, and he had called for help instead of going to her himself, because the professionals told him to wait. By the time they arrived, it was too late. He left Earth because he could not stand to be on a planet that held so many memories of what he had lost. Varus 4 was about as far from Earth as he could get, and the isolation suited him. He said he had spent 3 years watching animals through screens and cameras and telling himself that observation was enough. Then he saw Suri on his sensors, and something inside him broke open. He could not watch another child die while he did. Nothing. Suri did not know what to say to this story. Her people did not talk about grief the way humans did, and they certainly did not make life-altering decisions based on emotional wounds. But she understood loss. Her grandmother had died too, years ago, and sometimes Suri still woke up expecting to hear her voice. She told Jinho about her grandmother, and about the songs she used to sing, and about the way she smelled like spices and old books. Jinho listened and nodded and said that grief was strange because it never really went away, but it did change shape over time. Suri thought that was a wise thing to say. The clicking sounds grew louder behind them, and Suri picked up the pace as much as she could, with Jinho's weight dragging her down. The Thornbacks were regrouping faster than he had predicted. Maybe they were angrier than usual, or maybe they were hungrier, or maybe they just really wanted revenge for their wounded leader. Whatever the reason, they were getting closer. Jinho stumbled over a root and nearly brought both of them crashing to the ground. Suri caught him and held him upright, and her small muscles screamed in protest. She told him they needed to rest for a moment, and he shook his head and said they could not afford to stop. Then his eyes rolled back and he went limp in her arms. Suri lowered him to the ground as gently as she could and checked his breathing and his pulse. He was alive but unconscious, and she had no idea how to wake him up. The clicking sounds were very close now. She could see shapes moving through the glowing underbrush, and they were big, and they were fast, and there were more than 3 of them now. The original pack had found reinforcements. Suri looked at Jinho's unconscious form and felt despair wash over her like cold water. She could not carry him, and she could not fight the Thornbacks, and she could not think of any option that did not end with both of them dead. But then she remembered something her grandmother used to say. The sky ancestors did not make the Cathari to be strong like the beasts of the ground. They made them to be clever like the winds of the sky. Suri looked around and noticed something she had not seen before. The trees in this area had strange markings on them. Deep scratches and patches of missing bark that formed patterns too regular to be natural. These were territorial markers. A different Thornback pack had claimed this section of forest as their own Stories. Mind raced as she considered the implications. Thornback packs were fiercely territorial, and they fought each other almost as often as they hunted prey. If she could draw both packs into the same area, they might turn on each other instead of focusing on her and Jinho. It was a desperate plan, and it probably would not work, but it was better than sitting here and waiting to die. Suri grabbed Jinho under the arms and began to drag him deeper into the marked territory. He was heavier than she expected, and she could only move him a few meters at a time before she had to stop and catch her breath. But she kept going. The first pack emerged from the trees behind her. and let out hunting calls that echoed through the forest. Suri answered with a call of her own. It was a distress cry that her species made when they were in danger, and it was loud and high-pitched, and it carried for kilometers. She hoped it would attract attention. She was not disappointed answering calls came from ahead of them, and they were deeper and angrier than the first pack's cries. The territorial pack had heard intruders in their domain, and they were coming to investigate. Suri dragged Jinho behind a fallen log and pressed herself against him and tried to make them both as small as possible. The two packs met in the clearing about 50 meters away. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then chaos erupted. The sounds of thornbacks fighting were horrible beyond description. Claws tore through armor, and venom sprayed through the air, and roars of rage and pain filled the forest until Suri wanted to cover her ears and scream. But she stayed silent and still, and she held on to Jinho, and she waited. The battle lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When it was over half, the thornbacks lay dead or dying, and the survivors had scattered into the forest to lick their wounds. Suri waited until she was sure they were gone, and then she stood up on shaking legs. Jinho was still unconscious, but his breathing seemed steadier than before. Maybe the rest had helped him. She dragged him out from behind the log and oriented herself toward north. The monitoring station could not be more than 2 kilometers away now. Suri began to walk, and this time she talked to Jinho even though he could not hear her. She told him about the battle, and about how clever she had been, and about how her grandmother would have been proud. She told him that humans were not the only species capable of courage. She told him that they were going to survive this, and then she heard more clicking sounds from the darkness ahead. Not all the thornbacks had gone away to nurse their wounds. Some of them were still hungry. The lead thornback expected the human to break and run at the last moment because that was what prey always did. Instead, Jinho dropped to one knee and raised his shock prod like a spear and let the monster's own momentum drive it onto the electrified tip. The creature screamed as thousands of volts surged through its armored body, and it twisted away with smoke rising from the wound in its chest. Jinho did not wait to see if it would recover. He spun and fired his flare gun at the second thornback, and the burning projectile struck it directly in the face. The creature had no eyes to blind, but the heat and light overwhelmed its other senses, and it staggered backward into its companion. Suri watched all of this happen in the span of 3 heartbeats, and she could not make sense of what she was seeing. The human moved like water and fire combined, and he attacked creatures 10 times. His size without hesitation or mercy. Her people believed that courage came from careful calculation, and that bravery meant taking only risks that had favorable odds. This human seemed to operate on entirely different principles. The third thornback recovered first, and it circled around to flank Jinho while he was focused on the others. Suri saw it coming, and she tried to call out a warning, but her voice had abandoned her. The creature's tail whipped forward, and one of its venomous spines grazed Jinho's arm just below the elbow. He grunted in pain but did not stop moving, and he swung his shock prod in a wide arc that forced all 3 predators back. Blood ran down his arm in a thin red river and mixed with something green that made Suri's stomach clench. The venom was already working its way into his system, but still, he did not run. The lead thornback had recovered enough to rejoin the fight, and it was angry now. It let out a series of clicks that seemed to communicate something to its packmates, and all 3 began to circle in opposite directions. They were coordinating and adapting their strategy because thornbacks were not just strong and fast, they were intelligent. Jinho reached into his pack and pulled out his remaining flares, and he held one in each hand like torches. The light made the creatures hesitate, because fire was one of the few things on Varus 4 that could truly hurt them. He used that hesitation to grab Suri by the arm and pull her close to his body. She flinched at the contact because Kithari did not touch strangers, and certainly not aliens from other species, but his grip was firm without being painful, and his voice was steady. despite the venom spreading through his veins. He told her they needed to move, and she needed to stay close, and she needed to trust him. Suri had never trusted a human before. Her parents had taught her that humans were unpredictable and dangerous, and that they acted on emotions rather than logic. But right now, this unpredictable and dangerous human was the only thing standing between her death. She nodded and pressed herself against his side. Jinho began to back toward the tree line, and he kept the flares raised, and his eyes locked on the circling predators. The Thornbacks followed, but they did not attack. They were learning, and they were waiting for an opportunity. Suri could feel the human trembling, and she did not know if it was from fear, or from the venom, or from simple exhaustion. But he kept moving anyway. They reached the edge of the clearing, and Jinho told Suri to run and not look back and not stop until she reached the stream. She wanted to argue, but something in his voice made argument impossible. She turned and ran behind her. She heard the Thornbacks roar as they realized their prey was escaping, and she heard the sizzle of the flares and the crack of the shock prod and the horrible wet sounds of combat. Suri ran faster than she had ever run in her life, and branches scratched her face and roots tried to trip her feet, but she did not fall. She reached the stream and collapsed beside it, and her lungs burned and her heart pounded against her ribs. For a long moment there was only silence from the forest behind her. Then she heard footsteps, heavy and uneven footsteps that crashed through the underbrush without any attempt at stealth. Suri prepared to run again, but then Jinho emerged from the trees, and she felt something unlock in her chest. He was covered in blood and green venom, and his clothes were torn, and he was walking like someone whose legs had forgotten how to work properly. But he was alive. The lead Thornback was not following him. Suri asked what happened, and her voice came out as barely a whisper. Jinho showed her his shock prod, which was now bent at a strange angle and blackened with burn marks. He said he had shoved it into the pack leader's throat and held down the trigger until something important broke. The other two had dragged their leader away to decide whether revenge was worth the risk. They had maybe an hour before the pack regrouped and came looking for blood. Suri stared at him and tried to understand what kind of creature would do what he had done. Her people had a word for beings that acted without regard for their own survival. But it was not a complimentary word. It meant broken and wrong and dangerous. But standing here in the glowing forest with this wounded human who had saved her life, she began to wonder if maybe the word meant something else. Maybe it meant brave. Jinho's legs gave out, and he sat down hard on a moss-covered rock, and his face had gone pale and sweaty. The venom was getting worse. He told Suri that his monitoring station was about 5 kilometers north, and that it had medical supplies and communications equipment and walls thick enough to keep out Thornbacks. He said they needed to get there before dark. Suri looked at the forest around them and realized she had no idea which direction was north. The storm had scrambled her natural navigation senses, and the bioluminescent plants all looked the same. She told Jinho this and waited for him to take charge because he was the adult and he was the one who knew this planet. But Jinho shook his head and his eyes were having trouble focusing. He said the venom was affecting his vision and he could barely see the trees in front of him, let alone navigate through kilometers of wilderness. He needed her to guide them. Suri felt panic rise in her throat because she was just a child. And she had never been alone in a dangerous situation before, and she did not know how to save anyone. But then she looked at Jinho and saw that he had done the impossible just minutes ago. He had stood against monsters with nothing but courage and determination and a willingness to die for a stranger. If he could do that, then she could do this. Suri took a deep breath and closed her eyes and tried to feel the subtle vibrations in the air that her species used for navigation. The storm had scrambled things, but it had not destroyed them. Completely north was that way. She took Jinho's uninjured arm and draped it over her shoulders and helped him stand. He was heavy, and he smelled like blood and chemicals, but she did not complain. They began to walk behind them, the forest filled with clicking sounds as the thornbacks began to hunt once more. The electromagnetic storm came without warning, and it turned the sky above Varus 4 into a nightmare of purple lightning and screaming winds. Suri pressed her small body against the side of the transport vehicle as sparks flew from the control panel, and her mother shouted commands that nobody could hear over the thunder. She was only 12 cycles old, and she had never seen. Her parents looked so afraid. The Cathari were a careful species, and they planned for every danger, but this storm had appeared from nowhere, and it was tearing their trading caravan apart. Her father grabbed the emergency beacon, but it exploded in his hands when another bolt of lightning struck nearby, and Suri screamed as the vehicle flipped onto its side. Everything became chaos and noise and flashing light when Suri opened her eyes again. She was alone in the forest, and the storm had moved on to torment some other part of the planet. She called out for her mother and father, but only silence answered her. The bioluminescent plants around her glowed soft blue and green, and they would have been beautiful if she was not so terrified. Suri wrapped her vestigial wings around herself like a blanket and tried to remember what her father had taught her about survival. Stay calm and find shelter and wait for rescue. But which direction led to safety and which direction led deeper into the wilderness that even adult Cathari feared to enter? She chose a path that seemed to slope downward because water flowed downward and settlements were built near water. This logic made sense to her young mind, even though she had no idea if it was correct. The forest of Varus 4 was ancient and strange, and it had existed for millions of years before any species had come to claim this world. Massive trees with bark like silver metal rose hundreds of meters into the air, and their branches formed a canopy so thick that the sky was invisible. Suri walked for what felt like hours, and her thin legs ached and her throat burned with thirst. She found a stream and drank carefully because her mother had taught her to check water for parasites first, but she was too desperate to be as careful as she should have been. The water was cold and clean, and it gave her enough strength to keep moving. That was when she heard the first sound that made her blood turn to ice. It was a clicking noise like stones being struck together, and it came from somewhere behind her. Suri knew that sound from the safety lessons every Cathari child received before visiting frontier worlds. Thornbacks, the apex predators of Varus 4, were legendary among the galactic community for their brutality and intelligence. They hunted in packs, and they never gave up once they had chosen their prey, and they killed not just for food, but seemingly for pleasure. Suri began to run. Her vestigial wings flapped uselessly as she crashed through glowing underbrush and jumped over fallen logs and tried to put distance between herself and the clicking sounds, but the sounds only grew louder and multiplied. There was not just one thornback behind her now. There were many. She burst into a clearing and found herself at the base of a cliff that rose straight up like a wall built by giants. There was nowhere left to run. Suri turned and pressed her back against the cold stone and watched as three massive shapes emerged from the forest. The thornbacks were everything the safety lessons had warned her about, and worse, each one was twice her height, and they moved on 6 powerful legs that ended in claws capable of tearing through metal. Their bodies were covered in armored plates that shimmered with an oily rainbow sheen, and their backs bristled with venomous spines that could paralyze prey in seconds. But their faces were the most terrible part. They had no eyes that she could see, and instead their heads were dominated by massive jaws filled with teeth like broken glass, and they seemed to smile as they spread out to surround her. Suri tried to make herself as small as possible, and she whispered prayers to the sky ancestors that her grandmother had taught her. The lead thornback let out a sound that might have been laughter, and it took a step closer. 20 kilometers away, Park Jinho sat in his monitoring station and watched his screens with the bored attention of someone who had done this job for 3 years. The electromagnetic storm had scrambled half his sensors, but the motion Trackers were coming back online, and something was not right. He leaned forward and adjusted the display, and his coffee grew cold beside him as he studied the patterns. 3 large signatures were converging on a single small signature, and they were moving in a classic hunting formation that he had documented dozens of times. Thornback pack closing in on prey. But the prey signature was wrong. It was too small to be one of the native herbivores, and it was moving on 2 legs instead of 4. Jinho pulled up the biometric scanner, and his heart stopped when he saw the reading. Cathari juvenile female, approximately 12 cycles old. He was on his feet before he made a conscious decision to move, and he grabbed his shock prod, and his flare gun, and his emergency pack. The rational part of his mind told him this was suicide, and that he should call for help and wait for professionals to handle the situation. But the emergency channels were still down from the storm, and by the time he reached anyone with authority, that little girl would be dead. Jinho had watched something small and precious die once before because he had hesitated and because he had trusted others to handle what he should have handled himself. He would not make that mistake again. The forest swallowed him as he ran, and the bioluminescent plants painted his face in ghostly colors. He had spent 3 years learning every path and every shortcut and every hidden route through this wilderness. And now that knowledge might save a life. The clicking sounds reached his ears when he was still 100 meters from the cliff, and they made something primal wake up in the back of his brain. Every instinct told him to turn around and flee and let nature take its course. Instead, he ran faster. He burst into the clearing and saw the scene that his sensors had predicted. 3 thornbacks surrounded a tiny Cathari girl with feathers the color of sunset and wings wrapped around herself like armor made of hope. She was crying without sound, and her whole body shook with terror. The largest thornback turned its eyeless face toward Jinho and let out a sound of confusion. Prey did not run toward thornbacks. Prey ran away. Jinho did not give himself time to think about what he was doing, because thinking would make him stop. He walked forward until he stood between the girl and the monsters, and he spread his arms wide and screamed at the predators with every bit of air in his lungs. The thornbacks hesitated. This was not how hunts were supposed to go. Suri stared at the human who had appeared from nowhere, and she could not understand what she was seeing. He was soft and small, and he had no claws and no armor and no venom. The thornbacks could kill him with a single swipe, but he stood there anyway, and he did not run, and he did not beg, and he did not seem to care that he was about to die. The lead thornback let out a roar that shook leaves from the trees and charged. And the human charged right back.